Fanny, I was particularly struck in your presentation about the significance and the shortcomings of language. I was reminded of that wonderful encounter with the stranger in The Little Prince, and The Little Prince meets the fox. And the fox says, each day you shall sit a little closer to me, but do not speak, for the words are a source of misunderstandings. And I'm wondering, as a poet, what for you is the sort of gesture that is the bedrock for language to have meaning and significance?
How could I recognize authentic speech? Is that what you mean? How
Yes.
would I
Well,
recognize?
what sort of nonverbal gesture validates the language of poetry for you?
Mm. Nonverbal gesture. The face. That's all you need. I don't really know how to answer that. What would you say?
Well, I want to know if it needs to be a nonverbal gesture.
I mean,
Not
yes. I
necessarily,
mean,
but I was struck by the misunderstandings of language that led to burning at the stake and so on in the presentation. And I'm wondering, what is it about poetry that gives it the depth of meaning that it has as a language and not the shortcomings?
right. Well, I think the misunderstandings were somehow the vocabulary of a certain period, even within 10 or 20 years this can happen. The vocabulary fizzles, it loses its spark or its ability to cross over to the other. It's just become a dead word, a series of dead words. And this is what's so such a sign of how critical getting the words right for the moment are. I mean, for instance, right now, for some reason, the vocabulary of Buddhism suits the modern world. There's, people love hearing about the jewels and the lotus flower more than they want to hear about the 5 wounds. And so it's, there's something in words that rise with the time that you're in. And it's just a mystery why that happens. But you can see that the liturgy and what the priests used to do that would have brought these nuns out of their panic and delirium no longer had any effect at all. And so at that point, it was someone coming and saying, I'll take it all away. With me, it was like Christ, really, I'll take all your sins and walk away from here carrying them. That worked. And so it's just, you can't predict what words are going to work in a certain time. And someone like Shakespeare walks into a moment in history when the language is exactly right for his genius. And it would never happen again. If he had been born 40 years later, the words wouldn't have been there and the moment wouldn't have come. So it's somehow a magical thing. You wouldn't have a rule for it at all.
Thank you so much. Fantastic on both of you. One of the things I was struck about in both presentations was that this welcoming of the host seems to be connected in terms of traditions you're talking about with extreme self-deprivation and perhaps in a darker way with self-hatred. I'm thinking about this in terms of Simone Weil. The one thing she couldn't stand was the Jewish tradition. And one of the obstacles she had to entering the church was her insistence that the Old Testament was not a holy book. And that she resolutely distanced herself from that tradition. And that, and of course her family was Jewish, though she wasn't told that she was Jewish until she was older. But without getting into her, I mean, it seems there's a fine line between a kind of resolute denial of the self for the purpose of merger, or this wonderful phrase of annihilation of the self or unity, and a kind of scary
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you could talk a little about
I think that's supposed to be.
Yeah. I can start. Yeah, I think that it is precisely frightening, and that part I was struck and by, but didn't want to revolve too much. I actually didn't read your piece. I waited till I could hear it today because I didn't want to get too revolving around some of the words, because the wonder horror immediately struck me, because that they're in the same place in the people about whom I'm writing. That there's this horror and that is trying to. I don't even know how to describe it. It's a horror at what is. I'm going to use George Bataille language, who was a sort of frenemy of. I like that. George Bataille and Simone Weil were frenemies, but it's kind of true. But Bataille would talk about this radical hatred of what is. That had enormous political and ethical force in terms of injustice and realities of enormous suffering, and yet at the same time the desire to come to accept what is and to live fully in the moment of what is. And I think that Bataille understood something about the moment that he spoke to and understood the moment of the 13th and 14th century in a way unprecedented, I think, among 20th century thinkers who have maybe, except for maybe Simone Weil, who have worked with this text, because I think worked with some of this material, because I think it's exactly the same thing. There's this horror, and yet there's this loving embrace, and I think it has to do with what you said at the beginning, Richard, that there's something about when is the one you're welcoming the enemy, and when is the one that you're welcoming the friend? Well, all of these people are refusing to make that distinction. They're saying, I'm welcoming whatever it is, and if that rips me apart, that rips me apart. But that the onus of love is upon the soul in Margaret Perret. The soul has to allow anything to happen to her in her fidelity to love, even destroy love itself. And it's terrifying. I mean, and when she was accused for the second time of heresy, her trial in France, she refused to speak. She refused to answer any of the charges against her. She was absolutely silent. The end of words, the gesture of what that means. And so what is in that? Some people see that as a suicidal gesture, an intransigence, a refusal to try to save herself. For her freedom lay in that silence. So how do we make a judgment about that? This is where I had this line that I cut, where I said I'm tired of it. People yell at me for not explaining what I'm talking about. And I said I'm tired of pretending to explain the inexplicable. What about letting it sit there for a moment?
You want to
Well,
respond to the question?
well, I just didn't want to get into the Jewish question
Yeah.
with Simone Weil, because it's so complicated and so much to do with her personality. From earliest childhood, she identified with people who had nothing. She would refuse to eat when she saw someone couldn't eat. It was her personality, and what she had read of the Old Testament had to do with a cruel and monstrous God, as we saw in the film the last time, with the rape of the women and then God wiping everybody out.
About 3 pounds.
Yes, exactly, with Pam's piece. There was a monster God. That's what she saw when she read that. And then you put on top of that the whole issue of selection. She didn't join the Catholic Church. She didn't want to be identified with any particular institution. And it was all in that period of selection. And so she was resisting any form of selection when she said, I'm not a Jew, grew up as a humanist in Paris. It wasn't an anti-Semitic specific comment like that, but I don't feel, because she rejected so much of everything.
She starved herself to death, really, didn't she?
Well, she was dying of tuberculosis.
Yeah,
and
but she died because she really didn't eat.
She didn't have much of an
weakened
appetite.
herself so much, and this just goes back to the general issue of self.
She was
Masochism, you use that word.
Yeah,
of
but
a kind
yeah,
of-
it's like Law Creek. I mean, Simone Bay refused to eat more than the rations that were the food that was she thought was available to people in France under the occupation. And so again, it was. I mean, people fight or have lots of different readings,
Yes,
interpretations of this, but it was a very specific act of solidarity on her part. And so how we interpret that, I think, is open to question. Also, my understanding in terms of her refusal to be entered into the church, at least with her letters to her spiritual advisor, was because of the claim that the church's claim to damn the Jews and to damn sinners for all eternity. It was the non-universalism of salvation, and in that sense, it's really interesting because a lot of the women that I've written about also are constantly trying to undo somehow the church's claims to that some will be damned, and they're constantly trying to find a way to allow for the space of universal salvation, even if it means they're suffering in order to get souls out of purgatory, etc. So there's something that you can see as self-lacerating or opening up self-laceration, but more often than not, it's an act of solidarity with or an act on behalf of others. Even though we might still want to ask a lot of questions about how much am I really supposed to do for the other and who's doing it and how does that get positioned. I don't think the ethical questions end there, but they have to be talked about in that context, I think.
And it's also curious that in the letter to the priest, where she gives her reasons for not
Yeah.
entering the Catholic Church, she says, I mean, how can Jewish or Christian exclusivism ignore the fact that the Homeric Code is full of hospitality?
Right.
You don't have to wait for Moses
Yeah,
or
yeah,
anyone
yeah,
on
yeah,
Jesus to find this.
Yeah.
It's in these other cultures as well. And that's kind of a very open embrace of difference. How you square that with the denial of self is another matter. But that's a deeply spiritual question to me. You die to yourself and you become more available to others. I mean, maybe she did in extreme ways. It's debatable.
Yeah.
Maybe she was a saint. Matilda.
I'm wondering about the aspect of performance that Fanny raised first, is the question that Certeau asks, are
Yes.
they really it, or are they simply performing it? And that's a question that also, in some sense, comes up with the Beguines, right?
Mhm.
Because, and with obviously the burning at the stake of Margaret Bohet, as
Yeah.
a kind of extreme statement of, no, you are not the real thing. You are simply performing your own thing, and it's something for which you need to be eliminated.
Oh, that's how she was read by the
Right.
church. Yeah, no, I understand.
And in
Yeah.
some sense, Jacques de Vitry, writing about the Beguines, is a kind of defense of their authenticity, their
Right.
sincerity. They're not just performing; they really are.
But see, I think in this context, I mean, I totally take your point, but I actually think in this context in the 13th century, performance is authentic. I mean, I wouldn't pull the two apart, because Perret's book, if anybody has read it, is it's addressed to hearers. It's presumably was often read aloud, and it's very performative. It's an enacting of the annihilation of the soul through various kinds of rhetorical practices and dialectical movements of images, etc. And so I actually read the Mirror as a profoundly performative text, but it's not just performing, because it's through the performance that the soul becomes annihilated, and that this kind of transformation is enacted. And I think that's true for. And I guess that's part of my point, that very elliptical point about this welcoming of the guest, or the guest coming, the hosting of the guest. It doesn't just happen. There's these practices, right? Devotional practices or practices of detachment that prepare the space for the guest, for the divine to come into. And so that question of authenticity, which starts to get asked in the 12th century, people begin worrying about it. But there's a presumption that there's certain kinds of actions that prepare you. So you have to perform certain things in order then to be the space. And the moment from Mechthild that I describe is a performance. It's an enactment of a dance, and that's the way she describes this encounter between the soul and God. So there's something about the lines between performance and authenticity that is very different in this period, and I think needs to be parsed out in some ways. Yeah.
Well, actually, can I get to my question? Because
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stop, I'm sorry.
Your answer begins to get you to the extent that performative is a different way of thinking about performance.
Yeah, okay.
And so my question was really to the extent to which any one of these characters, that we're talking
Yeah,
about,
yeah, yeah.
whether Fanny's or yours, phrases this issue of questioning, self-questioning. Am I really in it? Of course I have to perform certain things to get there, but when do I know I'm there?
I see, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's okay.
Well, I think Certeau had the same question driving him forward through the book, just what you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
And he came out on the side of theater, that there was, it was sort of like Madoff. Once he put his foot in it, he had to keep walking. So it's the act becomes the reality after a while, and so it became indistinguishable, except for the weirdness of how quickly it all cleared up once Saran walked out carrying the demons with him. So that, of course, is performative, except then he went mad, so. Well, maybe it was real, so. But it's the embodied imagination.
Exactly.
This is the embodied
Yeah.
imagination. And how dangerous that can be.
Right.
Although in his case, he did exercise the knowledge and took it upon himself.
He did, yeah, but then
But
he,
dangerous to him.
yes, dangerous to him, yeah.
He made himself possessed.
Yeah, right.
Stephanie?
One of the things I've been trying to work out a little bit in the context of this seminar and the notions of hospitality and guest and how hospitable one should be. And I'm looking at kind of the context of, there was one analogy that Amy made in regards to God and the soul, host and the stranger. So, I'm presuming that the soul is the host and God is the stranger. The soul is trying to prepare to invite the stranger in. And that was under the section of Margaret Brett and annihilation of the soul. So my question really comes to kind of this notion of a passivity being equated with hospitality.
Yeah.
And when, and the looming sort of danger of violence.
Yeah, absolutely.
In there, and kind of, in the context of a seminar on hospitality and the stranger and how to set up a dialectic on hospitality, how do we reconcile this?
Yeah.
There's a lot of good content being offered, but then how does that really play into?
Yeah, no, I think that's the enormous challenge. I mean, I jotted down, Fanny, when you were saying this, that the guest versus the hostage depends on the freedom to leave, right? And perhaps that's true for the host as well. When is the host taken hostage by the guest? When the host is no longer free to leave. So I think it can work both ways. And I do think, in the case, and the movement from the women about whom I've written and the women at Loudun is really interesting because it demonstrates something that was also visible in the 14th century, was that in preparing an openness into which God can come. And, God also is the host who is inviting the stranger that is the sinner into his side wound, so it goes both ways. But for the soul, preparing a space, an openness in which God can come, the soul also, or the human being who does that, also makes themselves vulnerable to capture by enemy forces, i.e. to possession by demons in medieval terms and in early modern terms. And it's the same permeability or porosity that is actually associated medically as well as spiritually with women that makes them more likely to be possessed by God, that also makes them more likely to be possessed by demons. And one of the, and you get the literature emerging in the 14th and 15th century, this discernment of spirits. How do we tell? And so the men worrying about it. How do we tell as confessors whether it's a demon or whether it's God, or whether she's just an hysteric, which was also a possibility even in the 14th century. But from the women's perspective, it's the question may not be divine or demonic, but what is a passivity that is the rape of the soul as opposed to a rapture that is taking the soul to another place, and can we really distinguish those two things? And I think I think that, you know, these texts are, that I'm looking at our texts in which it becomes extraordinarily difficult to do that. And this is the scary part that I was talking about at the beginning. And, you know, it's the part that I think, I feel like, I mean, you know, I'm a kind of enemy of Levinas's, because I think that he renders, you know, he forces one to render oneself ethically, so, you know, passive to the other. And then I think, well, gee, I like this stuff, so what's the difference? And I think the difference is that there is a reciprocity here, where God is making God's self absolutely vulnerable to the soul, just as the soul is rendering itself absolutely vulnerable to God. And so there's a mutuality of this openness, of this bleeding, wounded porosity between the figure, especially of Christ on the cross, and the soul. Whereas in Levinas, it feels like, you know, everything's become so disembodied, and so, you know, I don't know, I can't describe it. It just seems much more a pure passivity without reciprocity, in which
Persecution.
exactly persecution. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, Floriana, and then Colleen and Stephen.
It's interesting to me because in some sense we're trying to understand these stories in the context of the time, which is, to begin with, very difficult for us because, you know, we're not in that time, and it's totally devoid of sort of our understanding of how the human brain develops or how the human being develops, where you could say that you're in a performance having something, trying on perhaps the fact that you don't love your body, or you're trying on something, you're working through that, and your mind and your emotions that derive from the state that you're in start to wire themselves to make that increasing and more increasingly the pattern that you're in, and then you don't have freedom anymore. But it's not, it's sort of because the physical being cannot undo these patterns that are brought to bear on where we are, and that could come from chemical, you know, could cause chemical imbalance, it could be from chemical imbalance.
Mm-hmm.
So today, we would start looking at this kind of hysteria, if you want to call it that, or rapture, as being something that has to do with the state of what we know of our bodies. So it's interesting to me because
Yeah.
we're trying to go back in time, but we're at another time, but we're not letting any of that sense into the discussion, it seems to me.
Do you have something on that?
I think that when you were talking about these ways to prepare oneself,
Mm-hmm.
through fasting, through contemplation, perhaps through neglect of certain bodily functions, I mean, that we know makes what you and I would call a chemical imbalance or a difference in the physiology of the person. So it would be unlikely that all those women would have had a similar physiological or hormonal malfunction that would lead to a kind of hysteria or auto-hysteria. And I think that across, I mean, my little bit of research into, for instance, Native American preparation for greeting the
Yeah,
golden
yeah.
spirit, they had a preparation.
Right,
Again,
right.
An expectation,
Right.
a fasting,
Right.
a journey,
Right.
Yes.
Right.
a vision,
Right.
and all that was conditioned by the preparation. So I understand what you're saying.
But there is, for instance, research in menstrual cycles that women in very close proximity, that starts to work harmoniously, that can lead. I'm just, you know, I think performance breeds performance. If you're amongst performers,
Yeah.
you start to take on the role and see, do you try it on? And what happens if you can't anymore walk away free?
The thing I don't, I mean, I take what you're saying, and there's two things I would say. One that I would say, I'm curious, Fanny, how you respond to this. I mean, the one thing I would say is that, you know, medieval Christians and like many Native American peoples, have a very acute psychology. And, you know, they understood a lot about how bodies and minds interacted. They would have talked about bodies and souls, and they understood a lot about how certain kinds of bodily practices could transform one's spiritual state and transform one's bodily state. And I think that it's actually, there's some work starting to happen now in terms of people who are, you know, interested in cognitive science, looking at medieval materials and trying to have these two bodies of psychological literature, the monastic material and the modern, speak to each other. So one thing is to say, you know, that yes, there's different conceptions obviously at place, but the notion that certain kinds of bodily practices bring about a transformation in one, you know, is shared. The thing that I find curious maybe about the formulation is, you know, if you say, well, they're performance and performance begets performance and then they're not free. Well, but if you're operating with that kind of deterministic model of physiology and of human biology, when is one ever free? You know, I don't see any space for freedom within that kind of a deterministic model of human being. You know, and that's where, for me, in terms of contemporary discourses, psychoanalysis is so important, because I feel like psychoanalysis properly, you know, certain kinds of psychoanalysis enable us to push against that kind of determinism, even as it may have room for understanding the importance of cognitive science, et cetera. So that's the kind of response I have.
No, I'm totally with you.
Yeah, I was just doing it.
No, that's all right, I totally agree with you.
I just want to go back to that earlier discussion about passivity for a moment. Passivity with respect to hosting the stranger and what's a healthy passivity and what's an unhealthy one. I just was very engaged by that, and your comments, Amy, regarding a critique of Levinas and the way that you're attracted to some of this literature of mysticism, and some of what you've read for us tonight, because you see God rendering God's self open and vulnerable too. I guess my question is, if the motif for God's vulnerability has been so predominantly the cross,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, not so great, huh? Yeah. This is total, I'm not a Christian, okay? I was raised Christian, I'm not a Christian. But the lotus flowers don't do it for me. And the cross really does. And I don't know, I think there's probably my own particular pathology being enacted in that, and I'm actually starting to write about some of that and think about some of it. But there's something about the deeply embodied nature of the cross.
what kind of deep?
What does that mean? A body that can suffer and bleed and die, which is the kind of bodies that we live in. The world.
Associated with it being willed.
Okay, and I think it's the question of it associated with it being willed. That's the issue.
Which was presumed by these women.
It was presumed by these women in the sense that it was presumed that God willed it in order to save others from precisely the kind of devastation that Christ's body experienced. Themselves too.
And themselves too, in that saving.
Yeah.
This way.
Well, I'm losing your point. You're
No,
saying
I'd
them.
love to hear you say more about
Well, I mean, no, because the women were. It's complicated. These particular women, for the most part, were not interested in and did not play up bodily suffering. It was much more about a kind of spiritual suffering, spiritual laceration. But it is the case, you know, that throughout the 13th, 14th century and beyond, there was women who thought that they could participate in Christ's saving act by suffering bodily and spiritually in ways like Christ. So yeah, that's absolutely right.
Julian of Norwich, was not her prayer. I think she suffered in order to
Right.
be united.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But she prays she prays for suffering in order to be united with Christ, but also to participate in Christ's salvific act and to save others through them. Yeah, I'm not. And this is where, you know, where to put myself in this is difficult, and I didn't do some of the things here that I want to do with this, some of this thinking. I'm not putting this forward as a model of how we should act. This is not what I'm doing. This isn't it. What I'm actually interrogating in myself, and this piece of work doesn't show it, is why it is that those moments are so fascinating to me, and why they're so powerful. I mean, that's the question that I'm trying to get to now, and the piece about. This piece, I think, is going to expand into something in which I want to write. There's various pieces of autobiographical narrative that are being interspersed with some of this work. And the piece that is crucial to me here, and I don't know quite how, but I'm just going to tell it quickly, is something about the Perrette story and her killing herself, her martyring herself in the face of love's demand that she allow another to love her more than him. I was asked to speak at a conference that's coming up called Politics of Love, or Politics of Eros, or something like that, and it's premised upon this idea of why can't love be part of politics? Yeah, I'm like, okay, but there's this notion of love as something very, very is the site of nurturance, of the site of life, of the site of all these things that are good that we value, and I realize I have this resistance to it, and the resistance comes out of an experience with one of my brothers when he was dying of lung cancer and was suffocating to death, and we needed to kill him, quite literally. I mean, they needed to give him so much morphine that he would die. And there's the moment of the look, the look from the nurse to me, we're going to do this now. And the nod of the head when I said, yeah, now is the time to do it. And I never have felt so much love in my life as in that moment when I knew that I had to kill my brother. Obviously, that's too stark a formulation, but it's what it felt like, and it's what it was experienced as. And that fact and that reality of love seems to me to be something that the cross depicts, and that these women's relationships to that understanding of suffering gets at in a way that I find our contemporary vocabulary is far too impoverished to name. So I don't think this is the answer, but I think this is part of helping me understand why I'm fascinated with this and what the site of impoverishment of our contemporary languages are.
That's it, yeah.
Do you agree, Fanny?
I do. And I mean, I would say my interest in this is because my mother was an actress. And I never knew when she was telling the truth or lying. And that's as simple. And that's...
I had one of those ones. Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment briefly on the tension between the disciplines of trying to maintain a space to keep open for God, and the quote you ended with Meister Eckhart on the need not to keep a space open for God.
It's like
such a great...
Two points come to mind. One is one of the tensions we've seen in our seminar on hospitality is the ability to welcome the stranger precisely as other and not as someone who is like me. And that seems analogous to me because there's a danger in trying to keep a place open for God that God emerges only as something that I produce. I strive so much in order to keep this place open that I wind up producing some form of God's presence. And so it's not really God as God, but God as I want God to be.
Yeah.
And I think that's precisely the point that Meister Eckhart
Yeah.
is trying to address there. And this also, I think, ties into Certeau, that wonderful quote about, were the demons taking over the space that was left abandoned from God. And I think this is something that we see in the phenomenon of secular culture, that God seems to be evacuating or abandoning all the places that have been traditionally set aside for him. And some that can be alarming for some, but is it possible to read that in the light of Meister Eckhart's insight of the need not to keep something separate, set apart for God, but just to allow God to emerge, as He is? I don't know if that's addressed to you, but
I certainly think that we're in a period of reinventing what it is to be human. And part of the seminar, I think, is that, and of course that involves the recognition of God as among us. But it seems to me that what Surteau is saying here is that it's a mass God now. It's not, we're all just almost anonymous, all but anonymous. And that, so we're in a new God period, which is almost at ground zero, and that it is new, and we're gonna have to figure out what the encounter means now. It probably isn't gonna be sacred spaces in that sense that we remember it in. And that's why we all feel kind of being lost and abandoned, as you say, God has abandoned us. But it's something else is happening that's a turning over.
And one wonders what it would mean to say that there's no place where God is not.
Yeah, exactly.
Connecting back to Pam's presentation and both of your presentations, I keep thinking about Yeats's poem, Leda and the Swan. And he retells Leda being raped by Zeus, who takes the shape of a swan. And he talks about her being mastered by the brute force of the air. And as I think about a poem and I think about your presentations, it seems that there is that instance where you're mastered by something unpredictable that will lead to some historical event, in both Yeats's instance and in Leda's case and Agamemnon and so on. But also in a Christian setting and in both of your talks, there was a sense of giving consent or looking for, or having that still voice in you that opens you up to something else rather than that just mastering you as a brute force. In Yeats's poem, there's a sense of, at the end he asks, did she put on his knowledge with his power? And there's that easy commerce, but it seems to me that in Desserteau, he seems to always be looking for that way where we can see that still voice, that something else that speaks to us, that we have to call out really intentionally to bring it into existence. So I was wondering if you think about that.
Yes, I do see that in him, and I think that I was sort of trying to understand why he has such difficulty writing clear sentences. Because actually, and it might be the translation, I don't know. But under it is such a pure and clear little note running through all of it, that you follow it with great. That's why I had him as my ghost, that I was trailing up and around the hills, because there is some little thread that you follow through, but it's hard to keep catching it through his sentences sometimes. But it's just what you're saying. It is that each person alone having to conjure it up. Really, that's the difficulty.
Could you, maybe we have to end
Oh.
now actually, but unless Amy wants to come in with something before we do. No.
I'm just thinking about Surteau's sentences. I'm sorry, he's always writing the passive voice. You can never figure out who's doing what to whom.
That's right. Yes.
And that is part of the convolution of the sentences and part of the opacity. And so when you were writing about that, that's what I was thinking about. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask Fanny to end things with a little memoir, which was in one of the versions of your paper, but you left it out in one tonight, where you actually heard the same music that was played at his
Oh, do you want me to?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, at the end of this day, when I was there with a friend in Loudun, we wandered through the town, and I was following the ghost of Surteau, looking for what had interested him and would it interest me. And I felt like maybe this was an absurd project, and we went into an art gallery at the end of the day. And my friend was wandering off looking at photographs, and I was sitting there, and suddenly the room was filled with the Edith Piaf song, Non, je ne regrette rien. But the thing was, he had it played at his funeral. He had asked for it to be played. So it was his ghost, it was just, and there was no explanation for that song. There was no radio, there was no speaker, there was no one turning on any music. It just suddenly flooded the room and then went. It was really, I tell you.
Yeah, did your
No,
friend
but
hear
my
it?
Friend was
Your friend heard it
a
too?
witness. I had a witness.
That's great.
You were great.
Oh,
It was
thank
just great. I loved it.
Oh, thank
Listening
you.
to those.